Today I will present my work from a distant point of view because I wanted to go back a while, let's say about 10 years, and try to focus about the longer period of my research. So let's say that from this title, Mapping Science in Immersive Architectures, we have two interesting concepts. One is the mapping of science in a very broad sense, because I will present you my work from the PhD and from current collaborations. And it's really the mapping of science, the mapping of people working for science, the making of science, which is really a subject of discussion of the field STS, for which I'm a professor at the University of Groningen. And the other side is immersive architecture, which is a bigger term invented by Sarah Kanderdijn, professor of experimental museology at PFL. But let's say that this is the part of design I would like to bring in science. So, what is about the presentation of today? I'm discussing a few concepts. Of course, there is the idea of mapping the behavior of scientists and science more in general, but even more abstractly, we have this concept of representation, which is very interesting to think about. And then we talk about the tension between individuals and the community, like in the very Gestalt theory sense. Of course, my work and the research is full of practice. So my practice is focused on network visualizations. So you will see a lot of case studies about this form of information design. And then two parts that I discovered during my doctoral studies. One is the materialization of data, so how we can present data in different forms from the digital. And another one is the restitution to the audience, because yes, we are publishing a lot of papers and so on, but when we represent scientific communities, for me, it's really interesting to offer the representation to the people represented in the image. So I start from the very beginning, because it can be interesting, especially for young people, because when I started studying at the university, I started with computer science, and suddenly I realized that maybe it was not the good faculty for me. But then I found that it was interesting, the opportunity to draw with the code. And in that moment, we had this publication of the library processing that was created at MIT by Casey Rees and Ben Fry. And it was just beautiful, mostly used for generative arts, but in general, very stimulating. And let's say that this was the phase after the HTML. And I was developing in HTML, CSS, and so on. And at a certain point, I had this very nice epiphany with the discovery of Adobe Flash that now is not working anymore. But for that time was really a revolution, because basically HTML was and is still very framed and difficult to organize. And basically with Flash, you had a different approach to the content of the web browser. You had the screen, and you were able to think in terms of time, because I think one of the big change compared to HTML is that Flash was embedding a timeline, especially when you were working in the environment. And so I was very young. I was collaborating with the university, and they asked me to teach Flash at the university. And let's say that my approach started in this way with computation and image. And then at the end of the university, my first specialization was interface design. I was passionate about libraries since I was young. And I had this beautiful opportunity to work with Carlo Ferrigato and some friends at the European Commission at the Scientific Library. And I was working like a researcher to try to organize the content in different ways. And in part, my work is still related to this. So let's say that I was interested in transform information, organize information visually. And the first way of organizing information was through interface design. But after that, I had this great moment. I moved to France for different reasons, and I ended up to work with Bruno Latour. And it's nice even to talk about him in this moment because he passed away just a month ago. And so I joined this team of AIM, Mode of Existence, as a designer of the digital book. So if you are interested, the digital book is still online and still in good shape, and it's a very nice digital edition, different from other products. But let's say that this moment in Paris for me was a kind of a revolution, because I started to play with information design. So I discovered the work of Emmanuel Lima that I recently interviewed and published this interview in Nightingale. But what was interesting is that there was this complexity of data, this complexity of a visualization. We were working with the first forms of networks, and there was something important to do, even in terms of design. And it was even interesting to work at that time at the Media Lab of Sciences Po, because Bruno Latour just moved from École des Mines to create this lab, and his idea was to put together computational science with sociology, and that was a good mix. But what is often unsaid about this is that the real glue between these two domains was design. And indeed, I was working there with Donato Ricci, Daniele Guido, and other smart people. But yes, we were doing a design, not just a sociology, not just a computational stuff, but a design, thinking about the digital tools in terms of design. And in that period, it was a part of the Media Lab, even Mathieu Giacomi, who was working with Tommaso Venturini. And let's say one part of the Media Lab was really working on network visualization. All of you, I think Gephi, the software. So it was very interesting for me. And just to reconnect with the beginning of my story is that yes, let's say I started studying how to shape, how to organize information. And then when I discovered the possibility of doing data visualization, for me was really an epiphany. At this point, I enter in the subject of my research, which is, in a broad way, it's about the representation of scientific communities. And my approach is very large on this, because we can represent scientific communities in many ways. And for example, for me, the portrait is one kind of representation. So for example, this is the chemistry lab of, I think, Cambridge University. And the portrait is a kind of a representation of a community. And at that point, I was in Lausanne studying with Frédéric Kaplan, and I was reading and discovering Roland Barthes, and it was just beautiful to enter in this French literature. So I started thinking how we can represent, because basically my goal for the PhD was the representation of the university. And it was nice because previously when I was in Paris, I represented a conference in through a logo, so a different kind of representation. And I remember that I was working with Wendy McKay for the CAI 2013 in Paris, and she told me, Dario, we have this big conference. Indeed, I think there were 5,000 attendances, and we need the logo. They had this payoff, changing perspective. There was the location, which was Paris, and I told Wendy that I had an idea for the logo, if she wanted to let me do this, and she agreed. And this is the logo of the conference. So I don't know how much among you are able to see the origin of this image, but let's say that the logo was inspired from the pyramid of the Louvre. And so was really the idea of a changing perspective. So not the standard landscape of Paris, but just a different point of view. And I remember that for that moment, and it's nice because we have Bruno again. Bruno was talking in front of a very broad audience. And the idea was that he was invited just to pay my doctoral studies with Wendy McKay. And so I did the design, I did the lecture, but finally it didn't work. But it's nice to see Bruno Latour with this logo design. And then it happened that I moved to Switzerland for the PhD second time, and I had the opportunity to work again with the representation of the conference, and I had more time, I had more skills and expertise. So my proposal was very simple and working. I wanted to represent the conference through the speakers themselves or the authors of the paper. So this is the logo of the Digital Humanities Conference of 2014. And the idea was really to create a network of speakers, of authors connected by interest, keyword, and so on. But the idea was really represent the community, the conference through the speakers themselves. And so I created this visualization, and I created also a more detailed design. And that was interesting because when I was working with Frederick Kaplan, who was my thesis director, we had this conversation about what we can represent with the network, and we were uncertain until the very last moment to represent keywords, to represent people. And finally he convinced me, saying we have to represent people because it's interesting to see the name of the name of people presenting at the conference. And we did this, and along this we wanted to create a narrative, to develop even a form of affection with the design, the logo design. So I was there, I was, inspired even by the possibility that Switzerland was offering. And so I created, I created Max, I created the catalog, the poster, t-shirt, visual, and so on. And again, even in that moment, Bruno Latour was there with, I think, a very nice speech about the digital humanities and digital traces. And you know, again, Bruno Latour was there to pay my doctoral studies. It was a kind of agreement with Frederick. And the conference is online, it's beautiful. Please go to check it, because it's really the origin of digital humanities, and I think that Bruno was one of the father of the world of digital humanities. But again, the idea was to create the affection to a logo, to the design of individual, to the representation. And something happens again, because with Frederick we had this idea to create a big poster. So we created this carpet with the image of the conference, and the feedback from the attendees was very nice. And this is a portrait of Brian Croxall with his identity represented on the carpet. And in general, it was amazing to have to see all the Twitter and so on. So we thought that something interesting was happening, the bound between the representation and people represented. And another beautiful photograph with my previous supervisor, Bruno Latour, and Frédéric Kaplan. And of course, in this photograph, there is no Boris Bod, but he was the second advisor, and we had this very great moment. And there was this nice story, because we were having lunch with Bruno Latour, and he was asking what you're doing, and I was saying it's digital humanities but related to design. And during the presentation he said that at a certain point you always need an Italian designer for your research. That was a nice catchphrase. Just to continue, let's move quickly to my doctoral studies. So when I was asked to join EPFL, I developed a project called Mapping Affinities, and everything is based on the idea that organigrams are very old and are just based on the same shape and as before. So the idea was to reinvent this, especially in terms of collaboration. So we didn't want to represent the university as a hierarchy of a professor, directors, and so on. But the idea, which is very Latourian, was to create a network of people. So this is the result, which is, of course, a network of lab. The idea was to present 70 labs of the ENAC faculty, who was paying for the doctoral studies. And the design is really complex and nice. So the idea was to present the lab in a system still available on the internet under the name mappingaffinities.epfl.ch. Yeah, so it's based on Switzerland, but if you check my website, you have all the links. And the idea was not to represent labs by hierarchy, but to represent them through collaboration. So a flat network in which collaboration is the main metric between to dissociate, to spacing out the labs. And everything is based on this metaphor of the zoom. So more you zoom, more you see details. In that case, you can even spot keywords between the labs, just to show what the labs have in common. And then you can keep zooming, and at a certain point you realize that labs are networks themselves. So even to simplify the visualization, because in this map we collected 1,000 people working for one faculty, we decided to create this network of a network, just to simplify the reading. And so one lab is represented by, of course, quantitative data associated to individuals. But what was interesting was to see the collaboration between the people in terms of publication, in terms of advising, and in terms of teaching. And to finally arrived again to the representation of people. So, for example, here you see it was the lab of Jacques Lévy with Boris Bod was working there, Monique Ruzka Rossier, even part of the lab. So again, despite the complexity of this visual output, we were deeply interested to represent the identity of people. And we passed through a process of materialization, because, you know, when you have a complex design and you want to address this design to a public, you have to create, to do it in a special way. And the idea that was at the base of this immersive architecture was to move the plan of a visualization to the space. So from the laptop, from the screen to the space, and the idea was to create a visualization for public space, for the public debate. So in this case, we were in a hall at EPFL, and we replicated the digital form of the map as a tour plan. It's beige, it's the one used for the trucks, and this is the delivery of the map, which is really materiality, you know. And it was very stressful, because I sent to the printer by email a file of 15 meters by 50 meters. It was quite exceptional. But what was really interesting is that we created this space. Was not just a visualization, was a space. We created an event related to other events of the faculty, and basically we created a conversation with people represented in the visualization. You have a version of me quite young, I think 6-7 years ago, but I was there with people, just engaging in a conversation and telling them the design choices we made to represent people in the visual. And this is another picture that it's interesting, because you can see much better the environment. So basically you have this visual in which people is walking, and from the walking perspective you can see the names of people, but then you have balconies. And it's another metaphor of Zoom related to Franco Moretti distant reading, but I liked a lot the idea that the viewers could be on the balconies, because from the balconies you had this view. And so again, it's immersive, and you have this special layer in which the reader of the map walking on this visual is part itself of the visual. It's becoming information in turn. And with a friend, Alberto Romene, we created this diagram, which is the diagram of design. So we have a cycle of design for the object, in that case the visualization, which is constantly updated by digital traces. And so you improve, you update the visualization, but at the same time, like Boris Groys is saying, we have an act of a self-design. So we read the visualization, we learn something from the visualization, and we improve ourselves. And what we try to say with this diagram is that the two cycles, the one of the visualization and the other one of the reader of the visualization, are connected. And this is a lemniscate in a continuous flow of information, which is, I think, a very nice image to think about. And so again, we created sweaters for the EPFL. We created the bags starting from the carpet, because it's kind of Freitag style, you know. And in this case, you see the bag of Dominique Perrault, the architect, the French architect, who was also professor at EPFL. And it was nice that sometimes even people was fighting to have their own bag, because both names could be on the same bag. So we had limited the number of objects to gift people. And just to end this section, this is the book I published last year with the support of APFL and the Swiss National Science Foundation. And it's in English and in French. And the good news is that the English version is open access and freely available on the internet. So after that, I started with my postdoc. I was working with Sarah Cardendine on this project called Supervision, and it's another way to represent people. So in that case, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of APFL with this beautiful museum of Kenzo Kuma on the campus of APFL, and my contribution was this mapping of a doctoral thesis of APFL. So was very nice to work on this, and it was the second time I was working a little bit more deeply in natural language processing, and especially on this metric based on linguistic similarity, in this case between doctoral students. But again, what was nice was that the visualization was a part of an exhibition. And so we were inviting people to interact this visualization. And in this case, we have Kirel Benzi, a colleague of mine, doing data visualization that was able to find himself in the visualization. So there is always this tie between the reader and the identity represented in the visual. So timing is kind of wrapping up, and I'm sorry for the break, but I just wanted to end up with the last project, which is very crucial, just to close with the concept of immersive architecture. Last year, I mean, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, we were wondering with a group of colleagues how to cope with the pandemic with our special skill. And we created the visualization with Hélène Casernat and Evelyn van der Boot and Humanities, which is a company based in Berlin, and Ars Electronica. And we created this visualization. I mean, one of the scariest part of the COVID-19 is the fear for the invisible. So we wanted just to represent the work of a scientist through data visualization, and we were able to create a visualization with 600,000 scientific articles just to make it tangible and visible, the large amount of the effort of the scientific environment. And here in the visualization you see this beautiful network in which each point is a scientific publication. And just consider that this visualization was created in June 2021. So I think at this point we can have more than 1 million of publication related to COVID. So we created this visualization, and this visualization again was characterized by keywords, and because keywords can give some affordances to explore the visualization. And what was interesting compared to other visualization I was doing previously is that we created a three-dimensional object, and so this object was based on the linguistic distance on 2 dimensions, but the third one was related to time. And you see this kind of Milky Way. This kind of Milky Way is really the temporal dimension of a COVID publication. So basically these 2 flat planes created by the distribution of scientific articles are 2020 and 2021. So it was really physical. So we created this visualization, and we had the beautiful opportunity to present it at the Ars Electronica Centers during this festival. And there is a beautiful digital theater, and that can house around 100 attendees, and you have a double projection, so you have a very computational power associated to this space. And what we created, it was a presentation in which we presented to a public during an event the visual. So it was really nice because the screen was immense, and really when you have this kind of screen, the experience is immersive. It's very different from a laptop. And what it's really interesting for me is that the experience of the visualization is public, is shared among different readers. And indeed, we created this event in which people were in front of the visualization. So we were there to tell people how we created this visualization and for which reason. And this is, let's say, this is the final image in which we presented, we disclosed the design process, but then we wanted to engage people in a conversation. So again, the very point of my discussion is that we can address data visualization in different ways, especially in public spaces. And what is important is to develop a data literacy about data, a visual literacy about the data. It's important to discuss with people and tell people how they can read visualization. And from this point, I just cite this passage of Paulo Freire, who is a scholar interested in education. And what is interesting of his work is the dialogic dimension of the conversation. So at a certain point, I realized that in my experience of a physicalization, I just wanted to find a sort of dialogue with the public, because I think it's the most powerful example of education, of dialogical conversation, and the very only way to pass knowledge to the public and to spread the work of data visualization and so on. Thank you for your attention.